This is H2O2 from H2O, and today we're going to cover assembling the board with the components. What you're going to need is your solder, and this one is 0.01, and you can go 0.02, 0.03. Those are all acceptable for this size of component. You probably need a little Pro Wick to help with any extra solder. You'll need flux and probably a pair of tweezers and your components. So let's start with your first component. This is U1. U1 is a chip operational amplifier, and as you look at U1 and the drawing, on the drawing it shows a little square divot right in this side, and that would be your left side. So on the chip, that divot would be right here, and that means that this is pin 1 right below it. So there's also a flat side on this chip, only on this side. It's like a 45-degree cut along this edge, and that lets you know that this is pin 1. So the divot would go here, flat side, pin 1. So we're going to position that chip about right there. We're going to center it on the pads, and we're going to solder one pin. I'm going to shock my tip, tin my tip, just so it's got a little bit of solder on there, not much. And I'm going to position that first pin okay. So now I'm going to make sure all those pins line up. I'm going to shock the tip. This is where the flux comes in. So we want to apply heat and solder to each of these joints, and that solder should flow up that leg and form a little concaved shape. It's very small on the legs of the pins of a chip. The flux will allow it to flow. Okay, here I have too much solder. Take your solder braid, your solder wick, a fresh area on that wick, and just heat the wick and set it onto the solder. What that does, it absorbs the solder into the wick and removes it from the board. Then go back, touch it up again. If your solder joint isn't shiny, it's not done correctly. There we go. And that's how you solder your one. Now we're going to solder C3. So the first thing you want to do for capacitors, resistors, things with 2 pads, 3 pads, you want to apply just a little bit of solder on one pad. I'm going to heat that pad and the end of the component together. Make sure it's right where you want it. It should be centered on that pad. If it's not quite centered, heat that joint again and gently move it. Then go back to the other side, heat the joint, the end of the component, and apply solder. You should have a gradual slope down and curved out to the pad, and the solder should form on that, creating a kind of a concave look to it. Then go back, and as it cools, you shouldn't be moving it or touching it, and it should be shiny and curved. Okay, that's C3. C1 is a capacitor that's made in long rods and then sliced up. And so you have a metal side and a part that looks like it's been machined. The machine side won't solder, so you want the side that has the shiny ends on it. So the shiny ends go onto the pads. Add a little bit of solder to one side. And then heat the other side and apply the solder. And go back. Fill that back in. Next thing I'm going to discuss is C2 and C4.